welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. Every week in Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science and its impact on society. And today, leading off, we're going to summarize some of the top stories in science. Our lead story today concerns outer space and the exploration of the universe. You know, last year it seemed so simple. President Donald Trump laid out a program for NASA. First, it would go back to the moon. After a 50-year gap, yes, astronauts will be setting foot on the moon. Then after that, we go to Mars. And then, who knows, beyond Mars. But now, President Donald Trump is beginning to change his mind. And this is already putting NASA bureaucrats into knots because of the fact that tens of billions of dollars of contracts are at stake. Because the United States has already committed to Boeing to create what is called the Gateway System around the moon to then eventually go to Mars. But now President Donald Trump is saying, well, why bother to go back to the moon? I mean, all the fanfare is about Mars. Let's go to Mars. So we'll say a few things about this debate, very old debate about whether to go to the moon or Mars. After all, Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, said we should go back to the moon. It's convenient, we'll learn a lot, and then use that to go to Mars. But then Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon, said, bah, humbug, why bother? We've been there. We've done that. Why not go right to Mars? So we'll talk about the pros and cons of the two. And Elon Musk, who's very definitely in the race to go to Mars, well, he has a problem because he has a noble goal, and that is to create the internet for everyone. A satellite system, perhaps consisting of thousands of mini satellites orbiting the planet Earth, so that anywhere on the Earth you would have internet contact. Think about it. You're on the top of Mount Everest, and there you are checking your email. But there are detractors of that grand scheme to make the internet for everyone, including poor people, and that is astronomers. Astronomers are complaining about light pollution. And speaking about light pollution, one of the greatest sources of light pollution, of course, is the sun itself. And scientists now are beginning to get cold feet when they realize that the sun has temper tantrums that could literally destroy modern civilization as we know it. The recent results from the Kepler space satellite and a European satellite shows that stars that are mature, like our sun, have solar flares much more frequent than we previously thought. And think about that. A gigantic solar flare could literally knock civilization hundreds of years into the past. $2 trillion in property damage, estimate some physicists, and we now believe that it's more common than we previously thought. Also, speaking about high technology, rare earths are now beginning to play a part in the China versus U.S. trade wars. In fact, the Chinese have hinted that they may begin the process of using rare earth boycotts in order to strike back at the United States. So we'll say a few things about what the hell is a rare earth, why do we need them, and this is taking place at a strategic time as China makes a transition from an export-driven economy to a consumer economy. And the question is, who's at an advantage with regards to a trade war in rare earth elements that affect high technology, China or the United States? And the answer to that question could determine the fate of the world economy as thousands of demonstrators demonstrate in the streets of Hong Kong against the mainland Chinese government's latest proclamations. And then on the health front, we'll say a few things about Alzheimer's patients. That's right, Alzheimer's. It turns out that some scientists believe that bacteria, germs, may be partially involved in creating Alzheimer's. And this theory was recently given a huge shot in the arm when scientists analyzed the tangled proteins associated with Alzheimer's of the brain. And sure enough, they found a bacteria, gingivitis. And if you watch TV, you know that gingivitis is what causes tooth decay. So in other words, if you want to have at least one line of defense against Alzheimer's, maybe, just maybe, brush your teeth. And then, of course, many health nuts say that you have to have 10,000 steps per day for good health. Well, believe it or not, that theory was never tested until now. And it turns out that, well, 10,000 steps for good health may not actually be correct. Well, let's just jump right into some of the top stories of the past week. The top story today revives a debate that has affected science fiction writers, NASA strategists, scientists, astronomers, and that is the moon or Mars. Well, there are 2 points of view that have good and bad aspects to them. Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, said that we should go back to the moon. We have unfinished business on the moon, much to learn, and we could use that as a hopping point in order to go on to Mars. Because after all, the moon is only 3 days away. Hop, skip, and a jump. It's easy to go back to the moon, and it would give us experience sending our probes into deep space. Well, Buzz Aldrin says, bah, humbug. Yes, the moon is 3 days away, and that's precisely why we don't want to go there. We've been there, we've done that, and there's really not much that the moon has to offer. Now, some people say we should mine the moon, but there's a problem with that. It turns out the moon is made out of minerals very similar to that found on the planet Earth. So if you want to mine moon rock, why not simply mine your backyard? You don't have to go to the moon to do that. And that's because the moon came out of the Earth. About 4 billion years ago, an asteroid the size of Mars plowed into the Earth, spewed out what eventually became the moon. And so, well, there's not much to mine on the moon except maybe helium-3. But you see, helium-3 is a rare element. It is found on the moon in small quantities, but it's for fusion reactors, and fusion reactors don't exist yet. So why bother to mine something, a fuel, for something that doesn't yet exist? So these detractors say, on to Mars. Well, Mars is where all the excitement is. It would generate lots of newspaper headlines. History books would have to be rewritten if we send humans to Mars, but there are problems. First of all, dangers to astronauts. A trip to Mars would take about 2 years, about 9 months to get to Mars, 9 months to come back from Mars, and then you have to wait for the right time to launch your rockets. So a complete trip would be about 2 years' time. In that time, we have to worry about weightlessness because your bones and muscles begin to leach valuable minerals. You have to worry about radiation because, yes, outer space is not protected by the atmosphere of the planet Earth. And you have all sorts of problems with accidents and meteorites. Yes, you name it, it's risky going to Mars. Well, what about the cost of a mission to the moon versus the cost of a mission to go to Mars? First of all, the NASA bureaucrats already have a plan for going back to the moon. They want to use the Orion space capsule on top of the SLS booster rocket to then send astronauts to the moon to build a space station. That's right, a space station not around the Earth, a station around the moon, which would then pose as a permanent way station for astronauts so that they could build a Mars rocket. So the Mars rocket would actually be built as it orbits around the planet Earth. Now, there's several problems with that simple scenario that was laid out by the Trump administration, and now Donald Trump is having second thoughts. Several points. First of all, the SLS booster rocket has been delayed. It has cost overruns, and some cynics are saying that it may never take off at all. Think about that. $1 billion per launch, one launch per year. You can't build a space programmer on a white elephant called the SLS booster rocket. Why not instead go with private enterprise? Why not go with Elon Musk? He has the Falcon Heavy that is cheaper, maybe 10% the cost of the SLS booster rocket, and could fly much more readily. And he even has a modified version of it called the BFR, which will go all the way to Mars. BFR stands for, well, B for big, R for rocket, and F for your imagination. So some people say that going to the moon, yes, it's possible. Yes, we could learn a lot, but boy, is it a waste of money? Why do we need a space station going around the moon? Now, our station is interesting because we can get all sorts of information about the Earth. But the moon is static. It's a dead world. We're not going to get weather reports from the moon. And so these people would say, on to Mars instead. Well, there are problems going to Mars, but you see, people often have a vision, and that's where these billionaires begin to disagree with NASA bureaucrats. NASA had a vision during the 60s, and that was beat the Russians. That was the vision. Well, that vision was fulfilled. We beat the Russians. We took our football, scored a touchdown, and went home. Big deal. That was 50 years ago. But now we have two more visions coming out. Elon Musk of SpaceX wants to create a multi-planet species so that we are not just flourishing on the Earth, but we have an insurance policy, a settlement elsewhere in the universe, because when he was a child, he read books like Asimov Foundation series, which I also read as a child. So he wants to take the first step toward creating a permanent Mars settlement, eventually of maybe 1 million people. The BFR rocket, now redubbed Starship, would take perhaps 1,000 people to Mars in each launch to create a settlement on Mars. Well, Jeff Bezos, richest man on the earth, he has his vision too, and his vision is different. His vision is to create a garden for the planet Earth so that heavy industries could be put into outer space, so that the Earth becomes a garden, a tropical haven for life, a playground for humans on the planet Earth, while polluting heavy industries are put into outer space. And Jeff Bezos, not to be undone, he has his Blue Origin program based in Texas. He has fielded a whole array of rockets, one rocket to simply take tourists into outer space, another rocket, the Armstrong rocket, would go all the way to the moon. And so we have not one, not two, but three competing visions for the exploration of outer space. And people are now scratching their heads and wondering, what does President Donald Trump want? The moon with the SLS booster rocket? Mars, perhaps, with the BFR? Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. And also, speaking about Elon Musk, there's a controversy about his latest vision. He wants to bring the internet to poor countries. That's a noble goal because the internet spreads democracy. It spreads information. It spreads empowerment. That's what poor people need. They need education to increase the productivity of their farms. They need information about politics so they know that a democracy can be vibrant and release people from dictatorships. So people need the internet. And if you have thousands of mini satellites orbiting the planet Earth simultaneously, it means anytime, any place on the Earth, you can dial up the internet and check your email. Even on the top of Mount Everest, there you are checking your email as you put your flag on the top of Mount Everest. So this is a real noble goal. However, there are problems. The first launch took place last week. It already generated controversy because astronomers do not like light pollution. Light pollution is already made it very difficult for astronomers to gaze into the night sky near cities. That's why we don't have any great telescopes in New York City, for example. Columbia University, for example, has a telescope there, but it's hardly research grade given the fact that the sky is constantly clouded over and there's tremendous light pollution here because of Broadway and because of the lights in Manhattan. So astronomers are saying, let's compromise. Let's make a deal so that Elon Musk can have his dream of a planet-spanning internet. Poor people can benefit by having democracy come to their doorstep, empowerment, political power going to poor nations and poor people. So perhaps a compromise can be settled so that we don't have light pollution that prevents us from understanding the universe, but we have the benefits of a planetary internet. And speaking about outer space and the sun, well, the sun is back in the news again. It turns out that the Kepler Satellite, which has been the workhorse of planetary astronomy, which has allowed astronomers to discover 4,000 planets circling other stars. Well, that Kepler satellite came back with bad news when it talks about solar flares from the sun. Astronomers used to think that gigantic solar flares that could literally blind an entire planet, were rare, but mainly found around young stars. Young stars are quite active. They have lots of solar flares, but our sun is, well, middle-aged. Our sun will last for about, 10 billion years. It's about 4.6 billion years into that life cycle. So our sun is a middle-aged star. And we used to think that solar flares are not common in aging stars. Well, the data gave us quite a shock. The data indicates that even middle-aged stars like our sun can also have solar flares, gigantic solar flares capable of wiping out modern civilization as we know it. Now, previously, in 1859, we actually have record of a gigantic event called the Carrington event. A gigantic solar flare erupted on the sun, and it wiped out telegraph communication on the planet Earth. All of a sudden, telegraph wires suddenly sprung to life. Also, you could read the newspaper in Cuba by the light of the northern lights as far south as the Caribbean. And we physicists have then begun to analyze that solar flare of 1859. Back then, we were not in the space age. We were not in the internet age. We were in the age of the horse and buggy. But we know the amount of radiation that was emitted from the sun, and then we recalibrated it for a modern-day catastrophe. And boy, were we shocked. We realized that the implications would be catastrophic. We would have blackouts over most of the surface of the planet Earth. Power stations would be short-circuited. Electronics would go out. Credit card transactions, the internet, weather data, GPS, all of that would be wiped out. Our astronauts in outer space would be in danger. We would have to order them to go into secure areas of the International Space Station, which have more shielding. In other words, it would be a real mess. Modern civilization would be hurled back 100, 200 years back into the past before the coming of electricity. Now, could that happen again? Something on that scale? And the answer is, well, yes. We now realize that it happened in the past, in the year 775. Centuries ago, in the year 775, by looking at tree rings and other pieces of data, scientists were able to piece together that, yes, something catastrophic from the sun happened in the year 775. Now, did humans respond to that catastrophe? No. We didn't have telescopes. We didn't have satellites. We didn't have telegraph wires. We didn't have the internet. I mean, it was even before the horse and buggy era back in the year 775. So these do happen, and they happen more frequently than we thought. You see, the sun has sunspots. Each sunspot is like a gun barrel. And periodically it shoots a gigantic coronal discharge into outer space like a bullet being fired from a sunspot. But for the most part, hey, space is big. So even though these gigantic coronal mass ejections take place frequently, they miss because the Earth is very tiny. The sky as seen from the sun is huge, and most of these bullets miss. But we now realize that grazing shots are more common than we previously thought. For example, Quebec, Canada, just a few decades ago, was hit by a near miss, wiping out electricity in that area of Canada. So we now realize that the dangers posed by a gigantic coronal mass discharge, the danger is much greater than we previously thought. Now, we physicists have worked backwards and calculated that property damage would be about $2 trillion. We're talking about food riots. We're talking about transportation coming to a halt, communications coming to a standstill. We're back to the horse and buggy era. And we asked Congress for millions of dollars to reinforce our satellites, to create redundant power systems so that we're not going to be in danger from a gigantic solar flare. And what do we get? A lot of snickers and basically nothing. So at the present time, we are sitting ducks for another gigantic solar flare, which we now realize can take place much more frequently than we previously thought. Now, that doesn't mean every year, but it does mean on the level of centuries. It means that we do have to worry about a monster solar flare that could send us back centuries into the past. Also in the news is a new trade war erupting between the United States and China that's going to affect high-tech industries, specifically a boycott of rare earth elements vital to the electronics industry. Now, why should we care? First of all, we benefit from high technology. A lot of the wonders of high technology have enriched commerce on the earth and has affected jobs, the economy, our way of life. But you see, high technology depends on rare earth elements. Rare earth elements that have certain electrical and physical characteristics valuable for the electronics industry. And where do we find most of these rare earth elements? Well, in China. Now, you may say to yourself, well, the Chinese wouldn't deliberately interfere with the rare earth trade, causing massive disruption, would they? Well, the answer is yes. And they already did that. Years ago, they used that threat of rare earth boycott against Japan. And now they're hinting that they may use it against the United States as leverage in its trade war between the United States and China. So in other words, we're talking about a game of high-tech chicken. Two sides, each determined not to budge, each barreling toward each other, and a collision could eventually take place. And who's going to be the victims of that collision? Well, you and me. Well, it's a game of chess. It's a game of strategy. Who's going to win if there's a war between the United States and China with regards to high-tech rare earth elements and also the economy in general? So let's size it up, because eventually it's going to affect everything, because many cheap goods found in the United States are made in China. The Chinese have benefited. Its middle class has prospered because of trade that was unleashed over the last several decades. The United States has benefited because prices are cheaper. But let's size it up like a chess game. First of all, China needs trade with the United States more than U.S. needs trade with China. If you take a look at the enormous prosperity of the middle class of China, you realize that a good chunk of that came from trade with the United States. It's been really lucrative for the Chinese to have access to the U.S. market. The U.S. in turn needs the Chinese market in order to get access to cheap goods, but the United States trades with lots of other countries as well. And if you look at the raw numbers show that in this respect, the United States has more leverage over China than vice versa. But also, this trade war is happening at a very delicate time in Chinese history. First of all, if you take a look at the party documents of the Chinese Communist Party, you realize that they are deliberately making a transition from an export-driven economy to a consumer-oriented economy. Remember Japan back in the 1950s? Japan was producing all sorts of cheap made-in-Japan goods. That was an export-driven economy, which took Japan, suffering from the ruins of Hiroshima, Nagasaki in World War II, and propelling it to the forefront of nations. That's an export-driven economy, but it's not a mature economy. A mature economy relies on consumer spending as well to raise the standard of living of its own people and to stimulate a different kind of economy. So China is making the transition now from an export-driven economy to a consumer economy, which is more mature, but it could be a rocky transition because the GNP is going to rise slower in a consumer-driven economy than an export-driven economy. The Chinese Communist Party realizes that an export-driven economy cannot last forever. You cannot maintain 10% growth rates forever. Eventually, you do have to make a transition to a consumer-based economy, but the transition could be rocky, and they are vulnerable in that sense. But even larger than that, the Chinese Communist Party, they say, made a strategic trade-off back in the days of Mao Zedong. Back in those days, you could motivate millions and millions of people with the promise of communism. That is, a classless society. Everyone would benefit in that vision. However, that vision gave poverty to the Chinese people. And then with Deng Xiaoping, a new bargain was given, that people would not be motivated because of the shining goal of pure communism. That was no longer the goal. The goal was a strategic bargain, and that is the Communist Party would bring economic prosperity to China by opening up its markets with capitalist ways and means in exchange for its grip on power never to be challenged. But now that grip is being challenged because of all the economic chaos. In Hong Kong, for example, we have hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets of Hong Kong because they think that the Chinese government has overstepped its bounds, allowing extradition of Hong Kong activists to the mainland, where many people think they would simply be put in jail and the keys thrown away. Good day.